On top of the purple one, you're going to label it natural selection. On top of the orange one, you're going to label that artificial selection. Artificial selection. On top of the yellow one, you're going to label that resistance. On top of the green one, adaptation. Okie doke. We are going to start with purple. So yesterday, if you were here yesterday we did a little simulation online that had to do with bunnies and their ability to take over the world. So at one point, we had taken the environment and you switched it to a cold environment. And what happened to the general overall color of the environment when you switched it to cold? Turned generally white. Okay? If those rabbits in that white environment had kept brown fur, or had brown fur, because we started with white fur, had brown fur, how do you think it would have been different for the rabbits with brown fur than the one? I need to take a step back. I'm getting ahead of myself. When we turned the environment to white, what happened to the number of bunnies? Did the bunnies get wiped out by the wolves? No, they didn't get wiped out by the wolves. Now, if those rabbits had brown fur, how do you think things would have been different for the rabbits with brown fur as opposed to the ones with white fur? Why would they die? Okay? All right. So the white ones blend in. There's a lot more contrast between the brown and the white environment, so the chances are they're going to be easier to see, easier for predators to catch them. So if there are bunnies out there with brown fur, and the brown fur comes from their genetics, and they're easier for the predators to catch them, do you think those brown rabbits are more likely to pass on that genetic information of brown fur to their offspring? No, chances are they're going to be taken out of the environment before they're able to pass on that genetic information. So when we talk about natural selection, that's what we're talking about. When it says best adapted, survival, blah, it just means that who's there to pass on their genetic information to their offspring. We good? All right. Who's there to pass on genetic information to their offspring? So if predators wipe them out, if disease wipes them out, if it's too cold or too hot or too saline or not saline enough, not wet enough, not dry enough, then whoever's not adapted to that environment, they're not going to survive. And if they don't survive, they're not going to pass on their genetics. That's what we mean when we say survival of the fittest. So underneath natural selection, the process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. The process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. The process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. A lot of times that terminology, survival of the fittest, is used, but that implies that one critter is too sickly or too weak or too whatever to survive in the environment, and that's not the case. It just means that they don't have the characteristics that they need to survive there. Brown bunny is just as fat, just cute, cuddly. He eats the same stuff that the white bunny does. His problem is his brown fur makes him stand out. It's not that he's sickly. It's not that he's slow, weak, or anything like that. It's not that he's any worse or not as good as the white bunnies. It's just that he has a characteristic that makes him stand out and allows nature to select against him. So predators are able to find him easier. That's it. That's all that is. Of course, if they're still around, they're able to reproduce and pass on their genetics. So on the front of that, you can give yourself an example that helps you remember natural selection. That's the rabbits versus wolves activity that we did yesterday. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with white rabbits or brown rabbits. It's just the characteristics that they naturally have allow nature to select for them or select against them. Doesn't matter if you have white fur or brown fur, if your fur is so thin that it doesn't help you survive the really frigid cold temperatures. So characteristic environments have a tendency to change, whether it be because we're changing it or because the environment itself is changing. So hurricane comes through and wipes out an area. Now all of a sudden we don't have forest. Tornado comes through and wipes out an area. Now all of a sudden we don't have forest. So we don't have the same environment that we had before. So the characteristics that allowed critters to survive before, maybe that's not good enough for them now. Because they were blending in with all the leaves, but now there's no leaves, it's all brown. And so they're green, but now they're sticking out like a sore thumb. So even though they're sticking out and predators are easier to see them, their brown counterparts are now all of a sudden they're able to survive even better because they can blend in even better. So a population that before the hurricane, before the tornado, was heavy on green-colored whatever critters, now green-colored whatever critters, they're getting picked off right and left. And the ones that are brown are able to survive and reproduce. That changes the population. Population goes from, gets skewed from high amount of green pigment to now high amount of brown pigment. Adaptation indicates that change in the fact that those traits that increase their chance of survival are going to be shown more in a population. So, adaptation, an inherited trait that increases an organism's chance of survival and reproduction in a certain environment. An inherited trait that increases an organism's, that should be apostrophe, I ain't got no grammar. An organism's chance of survival and reproduction in a certain environment. An inherited trait that increases an organism's chance of survival and reproduction in a certain environment. An inherited trait that increases an organism's chance of survival and reproduction in a certain environment. An inherited trait that increases an organism's chance of survival and reproduction in a certain environment. So nature is going to add selection pressures to different populations. And so that population is going to respond to the selection pressures. In this case, changing the pigment to allow them to blend in more. In the case of a cold versus warm environment, not just pigment, but maybe how thick the fur coat is, or do they have an underlayer, I can't remember what that's called. Undercoat, that's it. Of fur that allows them to trap heat closer to the body so that they could survive better. Right? So, give yourself an example. Adaptation. Don't laugh at my bunnies. They're adorable. Hot environment, nature is going to select. Nature is going to apply pressure that you want thin fur. Colder environment, nature is going to select. It's going to apply pressure for thicker fur. They're adorable. Pigment's another example, but I've got the fur. And so there's a shift in the population for characteristics. And that change is natural. As the environment changes, the species that live there have to change. If they don't, then they're not going to be there anymore because they're not going to be able to survive. And that's another change in the environment, in the community. Natural selection and adaptation. Well, natural selection is a pressure and a change applied by nature. Artificial selection is a man-made process by which there's a change in a population due to us and our selection pressures. Natural selection is nature's selection pressures. If the environment changes, it's going to apply a selection pressure for predators or mates or whatever. Artificial selection is man-made selection pressures. So for artificial selection, this is when we are purposely, whoopsies, we'll get that in just a second. We are purposely choosing organisms for breeding in order to create offspring with specific desired characteristics. Oh, I forgot a picture. Darn it. Purposefully choosing organisms for breeding in order to create offspring with specific desired characteristics. So probably the stuff that pops into mind the easiest is going to be our cattle, horses, dogs, cats. We are specifically choosing the parents in order to try to come out with offspring that usually has characteristics that's a blend of both. But we do that with plants as well. So I think all of the different types of apples we have come from some sort of human selective breeding and selective pressures to come up with a characteristic. We want them to be have a lot of flesh on their fruit. We want them to be sweet, or we want them to be tart. We want them to be this color, that color. A lot of the crops that we have, we selective breed them specifically in order to be able to be pest resistant or disease resistant. So we want these plants not to succumb to all these diseases that kill others out. And so that's selective pressures as well. So, example on the front of it. So I've got originally 2 different types of flowers. I have one flower that they grow really short, but they produce tons and tons of flowers. And then I've got this other flower that grows really tall, but doesn't produce a lot of flowers. So ideally, I mate these 2 to get the desired characteristics that I want from each. I want lots of flowers, and I want them to be tall. So I cross-pollinate the short plants that produce lots of flowers with the tall plants that produce a few flowers in the hopes of getting tall, lots of flowers. Breeding dogs, breeding horses, breeding cattle. There's a lot of money involved in that. If anybody has ever done that before or know anything about it, do you always get what you want? You don't always get what you want. So artificial selection, we are selecting the individuals to mate in the hopes of getting specific characteristics. Natural selection, it has to do with the environment and the characteristics that critters have to allow them to survive. Nature is selecting for or against them based on those characteristics. Sometimes the selection pressures that we apply aren't maybe intentional selection pressures, and so we've been talking about mosquitoes a lot lately. Mosquitoes? Mosquitoes, yay! Think about those food webs. They have a tendency to be close to the bottom of those food chains and food webs. So you knock them out and you are collapsing an entire food web or food chain, and that's not a good thing. Mosquitoes have a tendency to be a keystone species. So there's other things that eat the mosquitoes or eat the mosquito larvae. So little fishies eat mosquito larvae that are in the water sources, and so big fishies eat the little fishies, and then we eat the big fishies. Or hawks eat the big fishies. They are a food source. They are one of those trophic levels in that energy pyramid. And so they are a necessity. Just because they irritate us doesn't mean that they are necessarily a bad thing. It's nothing personal. It's not personal.
It's very personal. Whenever there's like 5 people and they only go for you, it's very
Yes. Oh, and do we want to talk about malaria and how malaria actually ends up being a benefit to some people who live where there's had sickle cell issues? Okay, so yeah, that's a whole another story. But yes, so they do have some pros and cons to them, admittedly. But they are a keystone species in environments, so we don't want to wipe them out as much as we don't like them. So we go out and we spray these pesticides, spray it all over the place, right? Kill them suckers dead. Well, as it turns out, when you spray those pesticides, most of them die, but a couple of them, they're still living there. Maybe they didn't get a full dose, or maybe they have the genetic makeup to survive that pesticide. So they're still around, so they're going to reproduce, and now you have a whole new population of mosquitoes that can't take spray A, or they can take spray A. So you spray A, and they're like laughing at you because, hey, that doesn't bother me. So, okay, spray B. Wipe out most of them, but there's a few of them that survive. They might not have gotten a full dose. Maybe they got the genetics, and now they can survive spray A and spray B. Spray C, and there's a few that still survive. So eventually, we are creating a population that has resistance. And now antibiotic resistant in some bacterial infections is a thing. Like MRSA, and there's some other diseases that these critters have resistance to antibacterial drugs. So now it's very hard to kill them out. I lost a nephew because he had MRSA, and there was nothing that they could do to treat him, and it got so bad that it got sepsis, and he ended up passing away. It's a real thing, so we have to be careful with that, and keep an eye on the things that we're doing. So on this picture right here, this grasshopper is happy, but this one's dead, and this one's dead, and this one's dead, and this one's dead, but this one's happy too. So I still have a couple little grasshoppers that are alive. I know, it's hard to see, but trust me, this one's alive and that one's alive. So I have grasshoppers that are left, and they probably have the genetics that enable them to survive. So they're going to produce a new population that are resistant to whatever pesticide that we put out for them. All right, resistance, the ability of one or more organisms to tolerate a particular chemical designed to kill it. The ability of one or more organisms to tolerate a particular chemical designed to kill it. All right, so on the front side of that, make sure you indicate the fact that some of these insects are not killed by the pesticide. They're passing on that trait. Or at least indicate that you've got some grasshoppers that are alive there. As soon as you get done with that, you can go ahead and set your spiral notebook aside. The worksheet that I gave you is from quite a while back. That's to kind of help refresh our memory on layers of the Earth and the atmosphere.